Well, it's actually not stimulus, Tiki. It is spending, no question about that. They're talking over $2 trillion of additional spending, bearing in mind that the U.S. was running a $1 trillion deficit for fiscal 2020. So put, say, $2.5 trillion on top of that. So we're now looking at a $3.5 trillion deficit for the year. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this because it is this is the greatest economic collapse since the Great Depression. Any reference to 2008 is really misplaced. This is going to be far worse than that. It's going to look a little bit more like the Great Depression, and we're going to have to dig our way out of it. So a lot of this is necessary, but I would not count on it for stimulus.
Yeah. You say QE, looking at the Fed and Jerome Powell, is no cure for a disease. Jerome Powell is basically saying he'll do whatever it takes. What can he do?
Well, he can do a lot, but again, it won't solve the economic problem. What Powell is doing, and I would say he's doing a fairly good job, he's keeping the lights on in the financial system, keeping the plumbing free, so to speak. So you're going to see the Fed's balance sheet go well past $5 trillion. It's already larger than it was after the 2008 financial crisis. By 2014, the Fed's balance sheet was about $4.25 trillion. It's already at that level just from what they've done. It's on its way to $5 trillion and perhaps $6 trillion by the time we're done. Again, do you need it to liquefy the financial system? Yes. But is it a source of stimulus? No.
Where are we with the markets and how they can assess the the degree of this crisis?
Well, very good question. And markets are pretty good at what they call discounting. So if there's or repricing rather. So if there's a shock, it could be positive or negative. The market will spike up to reprice for the good news, or it'll tank, sink to reprice for the bad news. So markets are fairly good at that, assuming they can estimate what the impact is. So if there's a natural disaster, or maybe when Trump got elected in 2016, that came as a shock to a lot of people, the market can reprice for that. The problem now is the market's trying to reprice, but they're repricing against an unknown. A lot of people, a lot of market participants don't know how bad the virus will be, don't know how far it will spread, how many will die, how long the economy will be shut. So you're repricing to a moving target. So I would say, yeah, we're down about 30%, give or take. But bear in mind, in 1929, from 1929 to 1933, the U.S. stock market fell 89%. In 2000, 2001, the NASDAQ, which was our tech-heavy index, fell 67%. That's what a real bear market looks like. So we could have a long way to go. In fact, I expect we do. There'll be these little, they call them sucker rallies, or mini bull rallies in the middle of a bear market. But the bear market is far from the bottom. That's because no one knows quite how bad this will be.
You've warned about these sorts of crises, downside scenarios. I mean, who could have predicted COVID-19, but in your book, say, Road to Ruin, you talk about the consequences of a crisis that could shut down a system. I think you use something called Ice 9.
Right. This is chapter 1 of my book, The Road to Ruin, which came out in 2016. And Ice 9 is something I applied to the financial system. Just to give credit, I took the idea from an author, Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote a book in the 1960s called Cat's Cradle. But in the Kurt Vonnegut version, there was a scientist who had come up with an isotope of water, very similar to water, but not quite the same. But it had the property that if you poured it into water, that water froze, and then all the water it came in contact with froze. So if a small vial were poured into a stream, the stream would freeze, but then the oceans and the entire Earth and all life on Earth would die. So it was a kind of a doomsday machine. So I took that idea and applied it to financial markets, and I was thinking about what happens when you close a market under stress. So you close the stock market, for example, because it's crashing, the circuit breakers don't work, et cetera. Well, the problem is that the demand for liquidity, people still want their money back. That's what a financial panic is. So if you close the stock market, they'll sell their money market funds. Well, then you have to close the money market. Then they'll redeem commercial paper, sell corporates, and you have to close that market. And finally, they go to the banks, and you end up closing the banks, which did happen in 1933.
Where are we now? What is the downside scenario, do you think, Jim? And how long is it going to take to rewrite ourselves?
Right. Well, we're dangerously close. I mean, again, more recent history. If you don't want to go back, one doesn't want to go back to World War One. 2013, the banks in Cyprus were closed. 2015, the banks in Greece were closed. People were flying from Athens to Frankfurt with empty suitcases, loading up on physical, paper euros and bringing them back to Athens because the ATMs were closed, the credit cards.
But we can't fly. So, we can't fly.
Yeah. Right, we've seen exactly. Australia can't drive. In America, who knows? We might not be able to fly. So, well, look, we've seen the stock. The floor of the stock market is the New York Stock Exchange is closed now. The market, most of the trading is automated, and the computers still work, but the floor is closed. Some banks have selectively closed branch offices. Not quite the full extreme I'm talking about, but dangerously close. As far as the economy is concerned, here are the issues, Tiki. GDP is going to drop some number, but order magnitude is 20 to 30% annualized in the second quarter. That's what we're looking at. We get our March unemployment report the first Friday in April. That's going to show perhaps 3 to 4 million unemployed. Typically that number is 200,000 new jobs. Now we're going to see 3 to 4 million job losses.
So
we've never seen anything like it.
We're talking a depression rather than a recession then in America.
I think that's right. This is a depression. So that's baked in the pie. I mean, we're in a depression. So here are the relevant issues. Number one, how long will it last? And number two, are the losses, the output losses, permanent or temporary? For
what
example,
about this idea of pent-up demand that people are talking about, that once we get through this, we'll have pent-up demand and we can recover? Yeah,
look, Tiki, you lived through 2009, 2010, as did I. Remember green shoots? All we heard about for years was green shoots. There were no green shoots. It was brown weeds. What we got was 11 years of 2.2% growth, at least in the U.S., a full percentage point below the average recovery since 1980, not even going back to the end of World War II. So green shoots was phony. Pent-up demand is phony. Here's why. If I usually go out, my wife and I go out to dinner on a Friday. We didn't go out last Friday. We're not going out this Friday. But let's say 3 months from now, things look better and we decide to go out for dinner. We're not going to have 2 dinners or 3 dinners. The dinners we skipped are a permanent loss. Now, let's say I was going to buy a car this week and I choose not to, but I go out in August and buy a car. Well, that's a timing difference. I did end up buying the car. So the car could be pent-up demand, but most of the economy, U.S. economy, is 70% consumption, and about 70% of that are services, not goods. So most of these losses are going to be permanent. Yeah. So I wouldn't expect to be recovery. And then as far as how long it lasts, it could be over by the end of the year. But do you have the famous V-shaped recovery where it goes down sharply and up sharply? Well, that's pent-up demand. If you have pent-up demand, that's what you get. Okay. This is not what we have. This will be more like an L.
Jim Rickards, we have an election in the United States. What's this doing for Donald Trump's prospects?
Until about a month ago, I had Trump as about a 75% probability, but that was going to go up perhaps as high as 90% by Election Day. However, that was based on the inverse of the probability of a recession. So recession odds were, say, below 20%. So you got to put Trump's reelection odds in the neighborhood of 80%. Now, of course, forget recession. We're in a depression. So does that mean Trump's chances are 0? It doesn't mean that, because nobody thinks he caused this. Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush lost because of recessions, but the recessions were caused by bad policies. Nobody blames this on Trump, but he will be judged by his response, by the way he handles it and how quickly we come back. So right now I've got a 50-50, but this is important because the market has not priced for President Biden. They're trying to price for coronavirus. They're trying to price for how bad this depression could be, but they haven't even started to think about, oh, gee, what if Biden wins? Whereas now that's a real possibility. So right now I've got a 50-50. That's not, throwing up my hands. The model still works, and I will update it continually. We'll see what happens, but you've got to make this a toss-up right now.
Jim Rickards, incredible to get your views at this extraordinary time. Thank you very much for joining us, and keep safe.
Thanks.